You've already heard a couple of references to our next presenter here today, and it's my pleasure to get to introduce Brenda. Brenda is going to give the history of the Freedom of Information Act, and she certainly knows it because she has been very active in that arena for many years, and among other things is one of the founders of the FOI Coalition, which is still a very active group, meeting especially although not exclusively during the general sessions of the legislature, when FOI legislation or legislation is proposed to amend the act. Brenda has been a reporter. She's still a columnist. She's also a book author. She wrote Political Magic, The Travels, Trials, and Triumphs of the Clinton's Arkansas Travelers. If you haven't read it, I suppose it's probably still available for purchase. And it's a quite entertaining book, and it's quite a story. But anyway, Brenda's here today to talk. I mentioned that probably because Brenda would be too modest to bring that up. But Brenda's here today to talk about the history of the Freedom of Information Act. So if you would, please welcome Brenda Blagg.
Everybody's tall. Can you hear me okay? I always get this kind of a job because I've earned all this gray hair. And I started earning it as far back as my college days, because I happened to be sitting in a University of Arkansas journalism class in 1967 when this law was being considered by the legislature. I became acutely aware of what the law could mean for the citizens of the state, because my professors were just astounded that the legislature was about to pass this thing. It had actually been written by Arkansas journalists, the first drafts anyway, led by Bob McCord, who had been, at that time, I think he was the editor of the North Little Rock Times. And of course, he was later in his life editor of the Democrat and the Gazette, and the Democrat Gazette writer, and a variety of things. We lost him a few years ago. But he's actually written a history of this law as part of a project I was involved in 1999. And if you guys want to take a look at that, it'll give you an even better view that I can give you here today of how the law happened. It's in the FOIArkansas.com site, FOIArkansas.com. We went out that particular year and challenged different agencies to present to us public records that were supposed to be available to the public. Some did, some didn't. And the project was all about that. But as part of the reporting, we have Bob's account of how the law came to be. And it's important to realize the role that Governor Winthrop Rockefeller did play back in those days. Remember, he hadn't been governor very long and had had a terrible experience out in the counties when he was campaigning and trying to collect information. He would go to the courthouses. Remember, Rockefeller was a Republican, and all of the Arkansas courthouses, every single one of them, were controlled at that time by Democrats. Well, he didn't get a real good reception, nor did his people when they went in and tried to look at, of all things, voting records to see who was voting, where they were voting, all that kind of thing, so they could do the normal campaign contacts. And he kind of became committed at that time, I think, to trying to get the records open. And when the opportunity arose, the journalists in the area seized on it. This was not the first Arkansas Freedom of Information law. This state, like almost all of them, back in the late 40s and early 50s, passed a sunshine law. But it was terribly flawed because what it basically said is you have to have your meetings open, you have to let people see your records, unless you think there's a reason not to, basically. You know, if you want to, you can do it. If you don't want to, that's okay too. The law had no teeth, no controls, really, so it was useless. And when the legislature considered it in 1967, this was a revelation, because it was very strictly written to allow just about any kind of access. Now, the truth is that if you read in that little booklet the list of exemptions, a lot of them are there more for political reasons than they are for what I would consider appropriate reasons to exclude people from these documents. But that was part of the bargaining to get the thing passed. So it's not a perfect law. It wasn't a perfect law in 1967, but it is one of the very strongest in the entire nation, and it's something we should all be really proud of. Like I said, the first laws came about in the late 40s and 50s because the returning GIs had come back and said, we fought for our country, now we're going to get involved. We're going to have all these babies, and they're going to go all to school. I'm a boomer, I don't know how many of you might be, but they did indeed fill up the planet, and they wanted to take part in the government. But the city councils and the school boards were all controlled by old white guys who were, they didn't go fight the war, so they took over control of the local governments. And they held their meetings in private. And these GIs who felt like they had a piece of this pie because they had fought and bled for it, wanted in. They got those first laws passed. And some of them actually were still in the legislature by the time the 67 law rolled around and participated. The Democratic leadership participated in support of this law. And when it finally passed, and this is really amazing when you think about it, the legislature was all Democrat. I don't think we even had a single member at the time who was Republican, but we did have a Republican governor. And they cooperated to pass this law without a single dissenting vote. Now, that's not going to happen on many issues. It happened then. It's partly because of the negotiation that those people made to get the law in a form that people could vote for it. It wasn't a unanimous vote, but the ones who voted for it. The ones who just couldn't walked out of the chamber, I suspect, or didn't come to work that day. Really, that's pretty much the extent of it. And I'll turn the program back over to someone else. But the big thing to know is that it came along at a time when the reporting was done very differently because you didn't have that automatic access. People didn't get to know what their governments were doing because they didn't have a law that forced the government to open itself up. And when we finally got a law, the Arkansas Supreme Court followed through with amazing decisions that reinforced it and said that the law would be interpreted liberally for the benefit of the public. And that has been a godsend. That particular decision had Bob McCord's name on it, but he had challenged them when Little Rock City Council, I believe, North Little Rock City Council, went into executive session and allowed a lawyer in at that time. And we have literally fought that fight in the coalition ever since. But even before the coalition existed, we were fighting that one. Because every 2 years, just about, someone wants the lawyers to be allowed to be in executive session with the board. Our fundamental answer is the lawyers work for the public, not the board. So I'm going to turn it over to whoever's next. Thank you very much.